At my husband's will, reading, my daughter-in-law looked me dead in the eyes and said, "Keep that dusty old ranch and get out of our lives." I walked away in silence. 3 months later, all of America knew my name. And her, she lost everything because of a secret buried beneath ice for 60 years. If you think this is just another family story, you're wrong. Hit that subscribe button now so you don't miss the next jaw-dropping episode we bring you. The wind over Aspen that winter was a predator, quiet, constant, and cruel. It whispered through the bare aspens and gnawed at the corners of the wooden house perched like an old secret in the forest. Snow had already swallowed the stone path by the time morning came, and the roof wore a thick white crown that had no intention of melting. Inside the house creaked softly, not from decay, but from the memory it carried. Lucille, 72, stood at her window in silence. Her hands, lined and careful, gripped a chipped mug of coffee. Outside, the world looked clean and dead. She didn't mind the stillness. She welcomed it. For 10 years, this home set at the edge of the northern ridge where cell signals died and coyotes roamed had been her quiet rebellion. The only movement came from Bear, her dog old like her with cloudy eyes and stiff legs. He rested near the wood stove, his breathing slow and rhythmic, like the ticking of a grandfather clock left too long in one place. He had been with her since the day she arrived here, with nothing but a duffel bag, a fractured will, and a silence that had grown thick around her like snow. Lucille's gaze drifted to the far corner of the room where the family portrait used to hang. Now, a blank wall remained. She didn't need reminders. They lived in her bones. It had been 5 years since Connor and Daisy, her only grandchildren, had forced her out of the ancestral home. It was in Denver, a big colonial thing passed down through 4 generations. Lucille had always believed she'd die there, the same way her mother had, the same way her father had. But tradition has no power when money is involved. And the moment Lucille began forgetting small things, where she'd placed her keys, what day the trash went out, Daisy had seized it. "She's not safe alone," Daisy had said, eyes glassy with the kind of compassion that came in convenient doses. "And you know how she gets forgetful. It's better if she signs it over now before things get worse." Connor had stood beside her, arms folded. "It's what Grandpa would have wanted." Lucille had stared at them that afternoon from across the long walnut table in the dining room she once polished every Sunday. "Is it?" she had asked, her voice steady, slicing through the room like a blade. "Because I remember your grandfather saying something different." But their minds were made. The signatures had already been prepared. All she had left was the option of dignity or a lawsuit she'd lose. So she packed what she could, kissed the doorknob on the way out, and came here to this cabin in the Rockies that no one wanted, where no one would follow. She sipped her coffee, the bitterness welcome. Outside, the wind picked up. The trees whispered warnings in languages only the old could understand. That night, the storm arrived without prelude. The news had mentioned a potential cold front, but Lucille had long stopped listening to anchors, who looked like plastic dolls and spoke like they were reading from cue cards. She trusted her bones instead, and that night they ached. She had just finished stacking the last of the firewood when she heard it. A crack, not like a branch, but like the shoulder of the earth itself being dislocated. Bear's ears perked up, but he didn't growl. He just stood slowly and looked toward the back door, his tail low. Lucille stepped outside into the pitch-black cold. Her boots sank into the snow with a sound that reminded her of wet bread. The moon was veiled, the wind sharper than before. And then she saw it across the backyard where the snowbank kissed the rise of the hill. The earth had shifted. A dark gash now cut across the slope like a wound torn open by invisible claws. Trees had fallen half buried in the snow. One had smashed against the far edge of the hill and shattered part of the frozen ground. She stood still. It was the kind of damage that could collapse a foundation, especially for a house this old. But something in her stomach twisted, not with fear but recognition. She knew that spot. Long ago, when she was still a teenager, her father would disappear every few weeks into that very slope. There had been a shed there once, now gone. She remembered asking him about it. Just tools and junk, he'd always say. But her father wasn't a man who kept junk. He was meticulous, secretive, and cold, in a way that made her mother cry when no one was looking. He'd worked for the government, he said. But what part of the government needed to bury things under snow? She returned inside and retrieved a flashlight. Her breath was visible in the air like little clouds trying to escape her mouth. Bear followed close, huffing. When she reached the slope, she saw the edge of something metallic peeking out from under the soil and snow. Not pipes, not rock. A rusted latch. Her fingers trembled as she brushed away layers of snow and soil, revealing what looked like the lid of a trapdoor, wooden but reinforced with iron bands. There were no markings, no padlock, just a ring handle corroded but intact. Lucille looked around, heart racing, though there was no one for miles. She pulled. It didn't budge. She pulled again, feet slipping in the snow, her shoulder straining. With a final grunt, it gave way with a sound that cracked the night open. A rush of stale air burst upward, thick with earth, and something older like time itself had been sealed shut and now groaned its way free. The flashlight beam cut down a narrow stairwell, concrete steps descending into darkness. She hesitated. Not because she was afraid. No, it was something else. The feeling that she wasn't just walking into the past, but into something that had waited for her. Something that had never truly left. She turned back to Bear. "Stay," she whispered. He didn't listen. He never did. They went down together. The air inside was frozen and still. Each step creaked beneath her despite being concrete. The place wasn't large, just a single chamber at the bottom, maybe 10 by 15 feet, lined with old shelves, crates, and what looked like military-grade boxes. She swept the light across the room. On the far wall was a small desk, a chair, a tape recorder, a rotary phone long disconnected, maps, pins, documents yellowed with time, all stamped in red classified. And at the center of the room sat a single object, an old metal briefcase, dented, dust-covered, locked with a combination dial. Lucille stared at it. She didn't need to open it to know whatever was inside wasn't meant to be found. Behind her, Bear sniffed at a box. She turned the flashlight. Inside were reels of tape, dozens each labeled with names and dates, many from the 1960s. She picked one up. The handwriting was familiar. No, it couldn't be. Her father's name was on the corner, J. Holloway, Operation Sparrow, Jan 1963. Her throat dried instantly. Her father had been dead nearly 30 years. She had spent her whole life never truly knowing what he did, what haunted him, or why he sometimes came home at night and sat in the dark for hours. And now here it was, buried beneath her house, as if waiting. She lowered herself slowly into the old chair beside the desk and stared at the case. Outside, the wind howled louder. The storm above raged. But down here in the hidden heart of the mountain, time stopped. She didn't feel 72 anymore. She didn't feel tired or discarded. In that moment, she felt dangerous. The case would open. The tapes would speak. The truth would claw its way back into the light. And this time she would not be quiet. The morning air bit deep sharp as a blade freshly honed. It crept through the cracks in the cabin's old walls, curled under doors, and wrapped itself around the ankles like a warning. Lucille stood at her back door, wrapped in an oversized wool cardigan that had once belonged to her mother. Steam rose from her mug of black coffee, untouched, forgotten in her hand. Her eyes were fixed on the ground past the split-rail fence, where something didn't look quite right. She'd been up most of the night, her mind tangled in restless loops, replaying the moment the earth had groaned beneath the storm. When she finally stepped out with Bear at dawn, the light was pale and ghostly. The storm had stripped the land bare of all sound. Not even the birds dared to speak. It was then she saw it, the snowbank near the back hill had collapsed inward. Bear sniffed the air cautiously, ears twitching. Lucille moved closer, boots crunching over the crusted ice. The familiar hill behind the house, the same hill she used to sled down as a child, the one where her father had once scolded her for snooping where you don't belong, was now scarred. A shallow pit had opened like a blister, and within it she saw something unnatural. Brick, not mountain stone, not roots or frozen soil. Brick and concrete in a sunken pattern, partially covered by ice. Lucille's breath caught. Her heartbeat ticked faster, not from exertion but recognition. Her father had built something here, and he had lied about it. She set her coffee down on a rock, dropped to her knees beside the collapsed area, and began brushing snow and dirt away with her gloved hands. The further she uncovered, the clearer it became, a square patch of brick, cracked in one corner, ringed with rusted metal. At the center was a steel latch, ice-bound and frozen in place. It wasn't a cellar, it was a hatch. Lucille stood brushing her hands off against her jeans, then turned back toward the house. She returned with a hammer and an old crowbar she'd kept in the shed for emergencies. Bear watched from a distance, head tilted, as she chipped at the ice encasing the edges of the hatch. The metal groaned under the hammer's weight. Her breath came in fast clouds. Her fingers began to throb with cold. But she didn't stop. Each strike was a question, each breath a dare. Why here? Why buried? Why now? After nearly half an hour, the latch finally shifted. The metal let out a shriek like a dying animal, and the square door cracked open just enough for Lucille to jam the crowbar into the seam and pry it loose. With a grunt, she lifted it. It opened with resistance, like it had never been meant to open again. A stale rush of air spilled out heavy with the scent of dust iron and time. Lucille coughed, waving a hand in front of her face. A staircase led downward, narrow, concrete, and steep. No railings, no light. She retrieved her flashlight and a lantern from the cabin, then tied Bear to the porch post. He whined low and unhappy, but she couldn't risk him slipping down there. Not yet. She patted his head gently. "I'll be back soon, old man." With a final breath, she descended. Each step was an echo of the one before. The stairs felt damp, lined with frost, and they creaked despite being stone. The flashlight beam bounced along walls marked with water stains and patches of moss. At the bottom, the space opened into a rectangular room roughly the size of her living room above, but colder, darker, and infused with something almost haunted. It wasn't empty. Along the far wall stood 2 metal shelves buckling under the weight of boxes, file folders, and what looked like film canisters. A small desk was pressed against one corner, accompanied by a single steel chair. The concrete walls were cracked but held firm, and in the very center of the floor a long metal container sat waiting. Lucille's light swept across the room, taking in the details slowly. The first shelf contained neatly labeled binders, all covered in thick layers of dust. Some were labeled in Cyrillic, others in English. Many bore stamps in red ink, classified top secret, do not remove. She moved closer, pulling out one file and opening it. Inside were black and white photos, stapled reports, and typewritten pages, all brittle with age. One document described something called Operation Ice Shadow. Another detailed a surveillance plan in Berlin. Every name was either redacted or Russian. Lucille stared at the papers with a creeping unease. Her father had told her he was a communications technician during his brief stint in the military. Wires and radios, nothing fancy, he'd say. But nothing about these documents spoke of wires and radios. Her hand trembled slightly as she set the file down and turned toward the center of the room. The metal container was a hard-sided suitcase, scuffed, scratched, and sealed with a single mechanical lock. She knelt beside it, brushing away dust with her sleeve. There were no markings, just a small square label in faded ink Mercer. 02-17-64. She sat back on her heels. Mercer. The name pulled at something in her memory. A news story, maybe. A man who disappeared. She couldn't place it, but it clung to her mind like wet wool. With a twist of her wrist, she tried the latch. Locked, of course. She turned to the desk where a drawer sat slightly ajar. She opened it fully. Inside were several odd items: a small Russian-English dictionary, a black leather notebook filled with numbers and shorthand, 2 microcassette tapes, and a faded passport. Lucille picked it up, flipping to the photo page. It was a man in his 30s, clean-cut, wearing a suit. Underneath the name, Thomas Whitaker, British. The paper was old but intact. The issue date was 1961. Then she found another, this one under the name Nikolai Sokolov. Same photo, Russian ID. A third American, Michael Mercer. Same photo, same man, 3 names, 1 face. Lucille stared at the photo heart pounding. Spy, triple agent, dead man walking. She took a shaky breath and examined the cassette tapes. Each one had dates scrawled in careful script. The first Feb 12, 1964, Prague. The second Feb 16, 1964, final transmission. She turned toward the desk's corner where a small tape player sat, an old reel model yellowed with age but still intact. A power cord trailed behind it. She doubted it would still work, but she set the tape inside anyway. She didn't press play. Not yet. Instead, she took in the room once more. Every detail was a contradiction. Her father's quiet, lifeless demeanor. The hidden past she was never meant to know. This place was more than a shelter or bunker. It was a vault, a confession. Her flashlight flickered. She reached into her coat pocket and retrieved a pen light, shining it along the corners of the room. There were more folders, some in locked cases, others labeled with names she didn't recognize. Project Greywind Ravenna, MK Iris. So many secrets so carefully buried. And then on the second shelf, tucked behind a stack of tapes, she spotted something metallic. It was a narrow box, plain steel, no label. She pulled it down, wiped the dust off, and opened the lid. Inside a set of old photographs. Her hand stilled. One photo showed a younger version of her father standing beside the same man from the passport photos. They stood in front of what looked like a Berlin checkpoint, dressed in civilian clothes. Her father's expression was unreadable. The other man smiled. In the background, barely visible, was a woman holding a child. Lucille froze. She knew that child. It was her. She recognized the dress. And the woman, it wasn't her mother. Her breath caught. Everything around her shifted solid ground, becoming fog, certainty dissolving into questions. She looked again at the photo. Her father's hand was resting protectively on the child's shoulder. The woman looked nothing like the mother who raised her. The date on the back, April 1961. Lucille clenched her jaw. This wasn't just intelligence work. This was personal. Whoever Mercer was, he wasn't just some foreign operative. He had been in her life, in her family's orbit. And now he was buried here beneath her home under decades of snow and silence. She stood slowly, the cassette tape in one hand, the photo in the other. This was no accident. This hatch hadn't opened by mistake. Something had wanted to be found, and she, an old woman with nothing left to lose, had found it. The cold in the bunker was different from the mountain chill outside. It wasn't just a physical cold. It was the kind that settled into the marrow, the kind that carried memory and shadow. Lucille sat on the concrete floor, legs folded awkwardly beneath her arms, wrapped tightly around the steel case, as if it could somehow anchor her to the ground. Her breathing was shallow, not from exertion, but disbelief. It was like trying to absorb an entire lifetime of lies in one breath. She didn't know how long she stayed like that. Minutes, maybe hours. Time bled in this place. The only sounds were bears' faint whines echoing from above and the soft creak of old pipes that hadn't felt warmth in decades. She kept her gaze fixed on the briefcase. It sat on the floor in front of her, solid and patient, its cold metal a quiet taunt. The label, Mercer. 02-17-64 played over and over in her mind like a broken reel. Her father's name wasn't Mercer. Her family had no connection to any Mercer. But there was that photo, her as a child, her father, and that man with too many passports. The truth hovered at the edge of her memory, just out of reach. When her legs finally protested enough, she stood with effort and made her way back up the narrow stairs. Bear barked once when she emerged, and she reached down to untie him from the porch post. "It's okay," she said, though her voice didn't sound like her own. "I'm okay." Inside, she placed the briefcase on the old wooden dining table. The rest of the house looked untouched, but to her the walls were already different. Something had shifted, something irreversible. That night, with a single lamp casting amber light across the room, she unwrapped the cassette player she'd retrieved from the bunker and wiped it clean with an old dish towel. It was a heavy thing built before the age of plastic and buttons. It had weight, purpose. She inserted the tape marked Feb 16, 1964, final transmission. She pressed play. The tape whirred, the sound grainy, hissy, like ghosts whispering through a wire. Then a voice, male, calm, American. "If you're hearing this, then something has gone wrong." Lucille's hands froze. This is Agent Mercer. Operation Sparrow is compromised. Repeat. Sparrow is compromised. They've intercepted the Prague courier. I've activated the final protocol. The evidence is secured in Colorado. Coordinates encoded in file Sparrow X3. If I don't make it to contact point Bravo, assume I've been taken or killed. A pause. Rustling papers. Then the voice again, this time slower, like it had aged between sentences. This isn't just about codes or betrayals. There's a child. She doesn't know who she is. She thinks she does, but I made sure she'd never remember. Lucille's breath caught. My last act as a patriot may not be remembered as heroic. I don't care. All I want is for her to live free of this, away from shadows. Click. The tape ended. She didn't move. She didn't blink. She just sat there, the sound of the final click still ringing in her ears. The room felt smaller now, like the walls had inched closer while she wasn't looking. A child. A memory erased. A man she'd never known claiming to protect her from the truth. Lucille stood slowly and walked to the fireplace, placing a trembling hand on the mantel. Her father had worked for the military, yes, but only as a low-level technician, or so he claimed. Communications. Radio transmissions. She remembered nights as a child, when he'd sit in his study with the door locked for hours, his voice low speaking into equipment she was forbidden to touch. Her mother never asked questions. Neither had she. Until now. She shut her eyes, and just like that the memory returned, not a clear picture, but a scent, a sound. Cigarette smoke in the hallway. Her father's voice harsher than usual, arguing with someone. A word repeated again and again. Sparrow. She hadn't understood it then. Now she did. That night, Lucille didn't sleep. She boiled water for tea and left it untouched. She stared at the tape, then rewound it and played it again. Over and over. Each time the same chill trickled down her spine. A child who didn't know who she was. A man willing to vanish to protect her from a truth she had never chosen. And still the part that gnawed at her the most wasn't the spycraft. It was the idea that her life, her entire life, might have been built on a story someone else wrote. By morning, the snow outside had hardened to ice. Lucille sat at her writing desk with a lined yellow notepad and a pen that dragged slightly on the page. She began to write, but not a journal, not a letter to family. It was a message, to someone who might understand, to someone who could do something about this. Jonah Creed. She hadn't heard the name in years, but she remembered the articles, sharp, relentless pieces that had exposed corruption in Congress, illegal surveillance programs, CIA cover-ups. He used to write for the Herald before going independent. They called him the man who made truth inconvenient, the kind of man who had made many enemies and few apologies. Lucille scribbled a note. Mr. Creed. You don't know me, but I may have something you've been chasing your whole life. Enclosed are partial documents, photos, and a recording from 1964 that I believe relate to a Cold War operation named Sparrow. If you think this is a joke, discard it. But if even a word rings true, come find me. No press, no cameras, just answers. LH. She printed the copied files from her scanner, dozens of them. The documents she'd pulled from the bunker. Photographs. The Mercer passport. She included a burned CD with the tape's audio. No return address. No personal detail beyond the initials. She packaged the envelope carefully and drove to town in her old Chevy, keeping her scarf pulled high to hide the tension in her jaw. At the post office, she paid cash and sent the package to Creed's last known mailing address, a P.O. box listed on his defunct website. As she drove back up the mountain, wind pushing her truck sideways in places she couldn't help but feel the weight of what she had done. It wasn't just curiosity now. It wasn't even about the past. Something in her had cracked open, something awake. By the time she returned to the cabin, Bear was waiting on the porch, tail wagging half-heartedly. She stepped inside and placed the briefcase back on the table. She stared at it again this time, not with fear, but with fury. Who the hell were you, Mercer? And why did you bury me in your secrets? The question didn't come with answers, but the silence in the room no longer felt empty. It felt pregnant with reckoning. The envelope arrived on a Thursday. No return address, no name, just his P.O. box handwritten in clean measured cursive. Jonah Creed stared at it for a long time before opening it. He'd received death threats in envelopes that looked friendlier than this. But instinct honed by decades of chasing ghosts and bastards told him this was something else, something different. He took it back to the Airstream trailer that had served as his home and office since he'd left New York 6 years ago. The view from his window was a sea of dust and wind outside Moab, Utah. Nothing out here but space and silence, and it suited him just fine. He tore open the envelope and dumped the contents onto the metal desk. Dozens of aged documents, most with redacted sections. Several grainy black and white photographs. 3 printed pages of what looked like a typed transcript. One photo made his pulse tighten. A man in a trench coat face, caught mid-turn near a rusted checkpoint sign. Jesus, he whispered. Mercer. He hadn't seen that name in 20 years, not since the agency had chased him out of D.C. for poking too close to Operation Greywind. Mercer was the ghost they all feared, officially missing in 1965, unofficially erased. Jonah flipped to the typed page and began reading. The transcript described a voice recording. Words like sparrow compromise and child leapt off the page like shrapnel. He reached for the CD included in the bundle and fed it into the battered laptop that sat perpetually on his desk like a sleeping dog. The audio file loaded, and then he heard it. If you're hearing this, then something has gone wrong. Jonah sat perfectly still. The voice wasn't just familiar. It was the voice. The one captured in scraps cut from old CIA reels, rumored to have existed but never confirmed. Mercer's voice, calm, articulate, faintly disillusioned, and suddenly brutally human. He closed the laptop and lit a cigarette, the smoke curling like a question mark over his desk. If this was real, and his gut said it was, this wasn't just a historical curiosity. This was dynamite in the wrong hands. The reference to a child, a buried cache, the quiet suggestion that something had been hidden for decades. It was too clean, too precise to be forgery. Someone out there had cracked open a Cold War sarcophagus and sent him the bones. Jonah started scanning the images, feeding them through a makeshift OCR reader. One of the documents included a partial field report from 1963 marked, "Do not duplicate." He paused at a line that mentioned a town in Colorado, then another that listed a name he hadn't seen in over 30 years, Holloway. He whispered it aloud like a spell. Holloway. Lucille Holloway. That name had shown up once, buried in a black budget ledger from 1972. A minor notation. Dependent of subject Holloway, non-operative, assigned protective cover post-Mercer defection. A dependent. A child. Protected. Hidden. He leaned back in his chair, mind racing. Someone had shielded her. Someone high up had wanted her forgotten. And now that someone was probably long dead, and Lucille, if she was the sender, was unraveling a secret older than she was supposed to remember. Jonah didn't sleep that night. He cross-referenced every name, every code word, every photo in the package. By dawn, he had filled 2 notebooks. And one thing was clear: this wasn't a prank. It was a fuse, and it was burning. The first leak happened within 36 hours. An anonymous Reddit user posted fragments of one of the documents, claiming it was part of a Cold War drop that never made it to Langley. The post was vague, but included enough visual evidence that intelligence junkies began speculating wildly. By the next day, Twitter was ablaze with hashtags #SparrowOp, #MercerReturns, #GhostAgent. Jonah didn't say a word, but the leak wasn't his doing. That terrified him more than anything, because if he hadn't been the one to spill it, someone else involved had. Which meant Lucille, assuming she was indeed the woman behind the envelope, was either careless or no longer working alone. And if the latter was true, she might already be in danger. Cable news picked up the scent like wolves. CNN ran a late-night segment called The Cold War's Last Whisper, featuring a still from one of the photos Jonah recognized as being in his envelope. MSNBC followed with a panel of talking heads speculating on deep state black projects gone rogue. Fox spun it into a conspiracy about sleeper agents embedded in American towns. And back in Denver, in a downtown condo paid for with the inheritance they thought was theirs, Connor Holloway watched the news with a beer in one hand and the remote in the other. Daisy sat cross-legged on the couch, scrolling through her phone. "You seeing this?" He nodded, eyes locked on the screen. "Wait, pause that," Daisy said, suddenly leaning forward. He rewound the segment and froze the frame. There on the screen was a grainy image of the briefcase. The same briefcase they had once seen in their grandfather's study, locked dusty, untouched for years. "No way," Daisy muttered. "Is that—" Connor didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. They both remembered the summer after their grandfather died. The family had combed through the estate, taking what they wanted, tossing the rest. Lucille had insisted on keeping the old junk. She took the maps, the tapes, the briefcase, things no one thought twice about. "She's got it," Daisy said, staring at the screen. "She had it all along." Connor sat back stunned. "She's the one who sent this in. No one else would have known what that stuff was. And look, she's probably trying to sell the story or something. You know how she always loved attention." Connor's jaw tightened. She refused to sign over the Denver house. Maybe this is her power play. They exchanged a glance, and without another word, Connor pulled out his phone and dialed. It rang once, twice, then voicemail. He tried again. Nothing. Daisy sent a text. "Saw the news. Hope you're okay. Call us. We're worried." Lucille sat in her cabin, the phone screen lighting up silently in the dark kitchen. She saw the names. She didn't move. She had expected this. She'd expected them to come sniffing once there was something to take, the same way scavengers circle a carcass pretending they mourn. She turned the phone face down on the table and walked to the wood stove. The fire crackled, oblivious to everything. She wasn't angry. Not anymore. She was done explaining herself to people who never listened. Done trying to earn a family she had never really belonged to. If they wanted answers, they'd have to go digging through snow and silence like she did. She owed them nothing. The truth wasn't theirs. It was hers now, and she would decide what to do with it. The first time Lucille noticed the black SUV, it was parked just beyond the tree line facing her cabin, like a predator testing the wind. It didn't move. It didn't idle. It just sat there silent and watching. By morning there were 3 more. When she opened her front door that day, her porch was already shadowed by a figure in a slate-gray parka and tactical boots. He didn't introduce himself, just nodded once and handed her an envelope with an official seal, Department of Justice, Federal Bureau of Investigation. Lucille took it without speaking. Bare sensing something unnatural growled low from inside. Over the next hour, men and women in unmarked jackets set up perimeter tape around her property. Not the bright yellow kind from television crime scenes. This was more discreet, more federal. One agent pulled out a scanning wand and passed it slowly over the hatch leading to the bunker. Another unfurled what looked like a radiation detection net. She watched them from her kitchen window, sipping coffee like it was any other Wednesday. She wasn't surprised. In fact, she was relieved. If the story had truly reached them, it meant the contents of that briefcase were too big to suppress. The silence that had cocooned her for decades had been cracked wide open, and now the wolves had arrived, all of them dressed in professionalism and badges. Just past noon, a knock came again. This time it was softer, measured. Lucille opened the door to a young woman, mid-30s, maybe younger, with short auburn hair tucked behind her ears and eyes that scanned like a lie detector. She wore a dark coat with a single badge clipped to her lapel. Not ostentatious, just enough to say, "I don't need to flash it twice." "Ms. Holloway," the woman asked, her tone polite but rehearsed. Lucille nodded. "My name is Special Agent Emma Clark. I'd like to speak with you about what you found on your property." Lucille looked past her to the bustle in the yard. A van had pulled in beside the cabin, and someone was unloading what looked like a mobile lab. "Seems like you're already speaking," Lucille replied. Emma smiled faintly, unfazed. "Do you mind if I come in?" Lucille hesitated, then stepped aside. Inside, the air was warm from the wood stove. Emma took a seat at the table, pulling out a small notepad and a pen. "I want to thank you for not resisting entry," she began. "I'm old, not stupid." Emma allowed herself a real smile. "I appreciate that." They sat in silence for a moment before Emma continued. "We've reviewed the documents that were leaked. We're also aware that Jonah Creed received an unmarked package. We believe it came from you." Lucille didn't respond. Emma pressed gently. The contents involve a classified Cold War operation. I'm not asking how you got them yet, but I need to understand what else you're in possession of. For national security. Lucille tilted her head. National security? Emma's pen paused. Lucille's voice hardened. Let me ask you something, Agent Clark. If I had stumbled upon a bundle of old love letters or war medals or a dusty diary, would you be here? Or is this about what those men did back then, being something you're still cleaning up now? Emma met her eyes. Some truths can cause more harm than good when mishandled. Lucille leaned in hands folded calmly. That's exactly what Mercer said, right before he disappeared. Emma blinked, just once. She took a slow breath and tapped her pen. So you listened to the tapes? Everyone. Where are they now? Lucille didn't blink. Safe. Emma's smile tightened. We'd prefer if you turned them over. I'm sure you would. Another beat of silence. You're not afraid of me, Emma said almost as an observation. Lucille shook her head. You're just the cleanup crew. The real danger. That was buried in my backyard for 60 years. I already lived through that. Emma closed her notebook. She stood. You'll be hearing from us again, she said. Lucille nodded. I imagine I will. Emma walked to the door but paused before exiting. For what it's worth, she said, I believe you did the right thing. Lucille said nothing. When the door clicked shut, she exhaled deeply, fingers trembling only slightly as she refilled her mug. It wasn't fear. It was adrenaline. A kind of electricity she hadn't felt since she was young, since her father used to disappear for days and return smelling like jet fuel and foreign cologne. Later that evening, as the agents began packing up, a lone vehicle appeared at the edge of the gravel road. Not a government car, something older, dented. Jonah Creed stepped out of a beat-up Ford Bronco, his coat flapping in the cold wind. Lucille didn't move when she saw him approaching. She watched through the window as he crunched across the snow, one hand stuffed in his coat pocket, the other holding a folder under his arm. He knocked only once. She opened the door and stared at him. You look like you haven't slept. I haven't, he said. They stood in silence for a moment before he asked, May I come in? Lucille stepped back. Jonah entered cautiously as though stepping into sacred ground. I wasn't sure it was you, he said finally. You were a ghost in the records. A footnote. Lucille poured him coffee without asking. Black. No sugar. He took it and nodded gratefully. I'm not a footnote anymore, she said. He studied her face. How much do you know, he asked. Lucille didn't answer. Instead, she placed the briefcase on the table. Jonah stared at it for a long time. Then he looked at her. You realize what this is? She nodded. Where did you find it? Under the bones of a life I never agreed to live. Jonah sat down. I've spent 15 years chasing whispers of Operation Sparrow. Got me blacklisted, followed, nearly indicted twice. And then out of nowhere you send me the Holy Grail. Lucille stirred her own cup. Why now, he asked. Why send it to me? She looked at him, eyes steady. Because you're the only one who ever told the truth and got punished for it. He nodded, lips tight. Jonah reached into his folder and pulled out a sheet of paper, a still frame from the surveillance tape inside the bunker, a photo of her father standing next to Mercer. You know who they are? Lucille glanced once. I know who I was told they were. Jonah tapped the photo. He wasn't just a comms technician. He was Mercer's handler. Your father wasn't a footnote either. He was a key. Lucille didn't flinch. Then he died for the wrong cause. Jonah leaned in. Tell me something, Miss Holloway. Who are you? Lucille stared at him quiet for a moment. Then she whispered, I'm just an old woman who got kicked out of her family's house for being inconvenient. Then she smiled, and I figured it was time I returned the favor. The second confirmation came not from Jonah but from the bureau. Lucille had just finished chopping wood when the knock came again. Not the polite kind. This one was firm, official. Emma Clark stood on the porch holding a manila folder. Her face said what her lips had not yet spoken. Lucille opened the door slowly, wiping her hands on her sweater. May I come in? Emma asked. Lucille stepped aside without a word. They sat at the same table where so much had already been unearthed. Emma placed the folder between them like an offering. We ran a facial reconstruction, Emma said. Cross-referenced with CIA archives, declassified Cold War intel in your documents. There's no doubt now. The man in those photos is John Mercer. Lucille inhaled slowly. She had heard the name whispered across the tapes coded in letters buried beneath false identities. but hearing it like this spoken plainly confirmed hit like cold iron in her chest. Mercer was listed as a double agent who disappeared in early 1965. Emma continued. Last known location, Berlin. He passed Soviet codes to the U.S., and when the KGB got wind of it, he vanished. Until now. Lucille ran a finger along the rim of her mug. There's more, Emma added, voice lowering. We recovered one final tape. It was hidden in a false wall in the bunker. You didn't send it to Creed. Lucille raised an eyebrow. I never said I sent him everything. Emma nodded, unsurprised. She reached into her coat pocket and withdrew the cassette in a sealed evidence bag. It was labeled but faintly just a date, 03-04-65. This one isn't intelligence. It's personal, Emma said. We transcribed part of it. Lucille's hand froze. Emma opened the folder and slid a single sheet toward her, typed double-spaced black and white. Lucille read the first line. If you're listening to this, then it means the plan failed. Or succeeded, depending on who you ask. She didn't need the rest. She had heard that voice before. Too many times to count. Not just on tape, not through headphones, but in real life, shouting orders across dinner tables, whispering across locked doors, humming in the garage while tuning old radios. She lowered the paper, her lips parted slightly, the disbelief still catching in her throat. It's him, she whispered. That's my father's voice. Emma looked at her gently. The two women sat in silence for a long while. Lucille's thoughts raced like 1,000 unsorted photographs, each one pulling her backward. Her father, James Holloway, had been a man of strange habits and long absences. He worked for Signals Intelligence, or so he claimed. But now that phrase felt like camouflage. She picked up the paper again and read aloud. The child is safe. I saw to it. She'll be raised far from this madness. She won't remember Prague. She won't remember the woman. She'll grow up thinking she's someone else. That's better. Lucille felt her stomach twist. Mercer took the fall. That was the deal. He disappears, becomes the villain. I stay behind and protect what matters. He gave me the tapes. All of them. Said if the world ever remembered, they'd understand what a monster peace had required. Another pause. To the courier, I'm sorry. You never asked for this. You were just supposed to deliver the package. But you became the package. Lucille's breath hitched. If you're hearing this, and if you are who I think you are, then I failed you. And I'm sorry. Her hands trembled. Emma said nothing, because there was nothing to say. Lucille stood slowly and walked to the window. Outside, snow fell again. Soft, steady, a blanket over bones. She pressed her palm against the cold glass. Her childhood came back to her in jagged pieces. The day her father slapped her for trying to open his desk drawer. The time he left in the middle of her birthday party without explanation. The strange lullabies her mother used to sing in Czech, a language Lucille was never taught. And the most haunting memory of all, standing in the hallway one night at age 6, overhearing a conversation she didn't understand at the time. She must never know. Now she did. She turned back to Emma. I was the package. Emma nodded slowly. Lucille sat back down. She folded the paper, then unfolded it again. Her hands needed to move to process. So who was she? She asked. The woman in the photo, the one holding me. Emma paused. We don't know, not yet. Lucille stared at the table. She wasn't my mother. No. Then what happened to her? Emma shook her head. There's no record. Lucille let out a sound somewhere between a laugh and a sob. Of course there isn't. A minute passed, then another, and then she asked the question that had been burning through her bones since she'd heard that tape. Why? Emma looked up. Lucille's voice was ragged now. Why would he do this? Why protect me like that? Why lie to everyone? Emma hesitated. Because maybe for once he chose something human over something patriotic. Lucille leaned back. The answer didn't satisfy her, but it was all she had. That night, long after Emma left, Lucille sat in her cabin alone. The fire had died down to embers. The tape player sat before her. The final cassette rested on the table just inches away. She hadn't listened to it fully, only the transcript. But now she needed to hear the voice again. Not the words, the voice. She placed the tape in the deck and hit play. There was static, then breathing, then her father, not giving orders, not hiding secrets, just speaking. I always thought I'd get to explain everything one day, he said. But time has a way of making cowards out of all of us. Lucille closed her eyes. The voice filled the room, filled her chest, filled the hollow space between fact and feeling. Maybe you'll hate me for what I did. Maybe you'll never understand. But if you're anything like your mother was, then maybe you'll forgive me anyway. Lucille's heart cracked a little further. The voice faded, and for the first time in her life, the silence that followed didn't feel empty. It felt full of endings, of beginnings, of truths buried and finally unburied. She was the courier. She was the package. And now she was the storyteller. The knock on the door was loud, eager, almost cheerful. Not the kind Lucille had come to expect from federal agents or curious neighbors. No, this was the knock of someone who believed they were welcome. Someone with entitlement humming beneath their skin. Lucille didn't answer. A moment later, the door handle jiggled. She heard the familiar beep of a smartphone starting a video. Then came the voice. "Hey guys, we're out here in Aspen at the cabin of Lucille Holloway, the woman at the center of the Sparrow File mystery. If she opens the door, we might get an exclusive look into the mind of the Cold War's most unexpected informant, our very own grandma." "Connor." Lucille closed her eyes. She stayed still behind the curtain, watching as her grandson turned to Daisy, who was holding the phone at just the right angle to capture both the door and their manufactured concern. "She hasn't been answering our calls." Connor continued, his voice a rehearsed mix of warmth and exasperation. "We're just trying to make sure she's okay," Daisy added. "We're really worried. It's all over the news. She's probably overwhelmed. Let's see if she'll let us in." They knocked again. Lucille opened the door. She stood there in her wool cardigan, no makeup, no smile, no pretense. Connor's expression brightened like a man stepping onto a stage. "Graham, you're all right." The phone angled toward Lucille's face. She didn't speak. Instead, she looked at the camera, then back at Connor. "Turn that off." He hesitated, pretending not to understand. Lucille stepped forward, eyes sharp. "Turn that off." Daisy lowered the phone slightly. "We just wanted to document the moment. This is history, Graham." Lucille stared at them both. She could smell the ambition on their breath. "You weren't interested in my life when I was living it," she said. "Don't pretend to care now that you think there's money or glory in it." Connor put a hand on his chest. "That's not fair. We've been worried." "No," she snapped. "You've been watching the news." Daisy stepped forward. "You're all over the internet. They're saying you might have been part of a Cold War child swap program." Lucille blinked. So the rumors had begun. Daisy, mistaking her silence for uncertainty, pressed on. Some journalist posted about a hidden file in the Denver archives. Something about a girl taken from Prague and relocated through a domestic cover family. "They're saying it could be you." Lucille's voice was ice. "And you thought you'd catch the big reveal on livestream." Connor lowered his phone. "We just want to understand, Graham. Why didn't you tell us?" Lucille stepped out onto the porch. She didn't raise her voice, didn't tremble. "I invited you into my life for years. You shut the door every time. You wanted my house, not my story. Now you're here with phones and forced sympathy because someone else told you I was interesting. Graham, leave." "But," I said, "leave." They hesitated. She stepped toward them. For the first time in their lives, they saw not an old woman, but a gatekeeper. Daisy pulled Connor by the arm. "Come on." As they walked back to their car, Lucille turned, went inside, and closed the door without watching them go. By that evening, the internet was brimming with speculation. Reddit threads exploded with comparisons between Lucille and the unidentified girl in a photo from 1961, taken at a Berlin checkpoint standing beside a woman in a headscarf, cradled in the arms of John Mercer. TikTok accounts recreated the timeline. Podcasts titled The Sparrow's Child hit the charts overnight. One YouTube video analyzed her facial structure, overlaying it with facial recognition software. A 78% match to the child last seen in Prague in 1961. News anchors debated whether she should be considered a hero, a victim, or both. And still Lucille said nothing. She didn't release a statement, didn't confirm or deny. She sat in her chair by the fire tape player in her lap, bare curled at her feet. The world could speculate all it wanted. The truth didn't belong to them. That night Emma returned. No badge, no jacket. Just a woman in a gray sweater and jeans holding a folder and a face that no longer pretended. Lucille poured 2 cups of coffee without asking. Emma didn't speak at first. She sat across the table and opened the folder. Inside were 3 documents. One was a declassified report from 1965, detailing Operation Disavowal, a program designed to relocate children of compromised agents under new identities. The second was a DNA comparison between Lucille's genetic material taken from a coffee mug and a tissue recovered from an archived KGB case file. Positive match. Lucille stared at the third page, a memo between two intelligence officers, arguing whether the Holloway cover should be maintained or dismantled. Emma leaned forward. "If it's true," she said quietly, "then your father gave up his life and his name to protect you. Mercer, too." Lucille looked at the page again. "It doesn't feel like protection," she said. "It feels like theft." Emma nodded slowly. "That's because it was." Lucille ran a hand through her thinning hair. "Why now? Why did this come up now?" Emma hesitated. "Because the documents you found weren't supposed to be buried there forever. They were part of a dead man's switch. Mercer must have hidden them, knowing someone someday would stumble onto them. And that someone was you." Lucille scoffed. "I wasn't chosen. I just didn't freeze to death first." Emma's tone shifted. "That may be. But if the press is right, if you really are the child they think you are, then you're holding proof of an intelligence scandal that rewrites Cold War history. You're the thread that unravels a myth we've protected for 60 years. Lucille let out a tired breath. "And what happens now?" Emma folded her hands. "That depends on you. The Bureau wants the story contained. But I think the world needs to hear it." Lucille stared at her. The world hadn't cared when she was evicted from her own home. The world hadn't cared when she buried her parents, when she nursed her dying husband, when she fought off the darkness of old age with nothing but a dog and a deck of cards. Now the world cared because of a headline, because of a story. She stood and walked to the window. Outside, the snow had begun again, soft, relentless. "People want legends," she said, "not the people who survive them." Emma joined her at the window. "Then maybe it's time they got both." Lucille turned and met her eyes. For the first time, she saw something honest there. Not protocol, not training, just belief. And for the first time, Lucille didn't feel like the story was about someone else. It was hers, all of it. The lies, the exile, the silence, and now perhaps the voice. It happened just after midnight. The fire had burned low in the hearth, casting long shadows that reached across the cabin like fingers. Lucille had fallen asleep in her chair, her hand still resting on a folder of documents she'd read for the 5th time that day. Bear lay curled at her feet, his breathing steady, the occasional twitch of an ear, the only sign he still dreamt. The wind outside howled as usual, but this time it wasn't what woke her. It was the creak, soft but undeniable, the kind of sound that came not from a settling wall or the shifting roof, but from footsteps inside the house. Lucille's eyes opened instantly, her body still. She didn't reach for a phone, didn't call out. She'd lived alone too long to invite panic. She listened. Another step, this time closer. Bear's ears perked up. A low growl started in his throat. Lucille rose slowly, every joint protesting but her mind sharp. She moved toward the drawer beneath the counter where she kept the old revolver. Not loaded, not anymore. But it still made a sound when cocked, and sometimes sound was all you needed. But before her hand touched the drawer, the voice came. "Don't." Low, gravelly, male. She turned. There he was. A man mid-70s, maybe older, stood in the shadow between the kitchen and the hallway, silhouetted against the dark. He wore a long coat wet from snow, his gloved hands held out to his sides, not threatening, but not harmless either. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said. Lucille narrowed her eyes. "You broke into my home." "I knocked first," he replied, voice brittle with amusement. "You didn't answer." Bear growled louder now, inching forward, teeth exposed. The man didn't flinch. "Who are you?" Lucille asked. He stepped forward into the faint light, revealing a weathered face beneath a wool cap. Deep lines cut into his cheeks like scars carved by time. His eyes were sharp, intelligent, the kind that used to scan rooftops for snipers. "My name won't mean anything to you," he said, "but I served with Mercer." Lucille's breath caught. She said nothing. He nodded at the folder still on the chair. "That's why I'm here." "You came for the documents?" she asked. "No, I came to warn you." She didn't move, but her fingers found the drawer anyway, rested lightly on it. "There are people watching this unfold," he said. "People who don't want the past disturbed." You think the FBI's the only suit in the game? Lucille said nothing. He stepped closer, not too close, just enough that the firelight caught the glint of something metallic beneath his coat, a dog tag perhaps hanging from a chain. You're playing with matches in a house full of dry wood, he continued. Mercer knew that. That's why he buried it. Lucille's voice came back calm and steady. Mercer wanted it found. He gave a dry laugh. Mercer wanted options. He wasn't sure which future would be worse, letting it rot in silence or letting the world tear it open. She met his eyes. Then why did he record the tapes? Because he was a man with guilt. And guilt makes you document things just in case your conscience shows up one day in the form of a granddaughter with too many questions. Lucille's lips tightened. The man studied her. You really don't know how deep this goes, do you? He asked. I'm starting to. He nodded toward the briefcase on the side table. They'll come for that. Not with subpoenas. With silence. One day you'll turn on your TV and they'll say this was a hoax, that you were confused. Maybe they'll find a doctor willing to sign a letter saying you're senile. Lucille's face darkened. He continued. Don't trust the ones in uniforms just because they have badges. And don't trust the journalists just because they ask the right questions. She crossed her arms. So who do I trust? He hesitated. Then almost apologetically said no one. Lucille laughed once. It wasn't amused. It was recognition. She stepped past him and picked up the revolver from the drawer, not to point it, just to hold it. For memory's sake. Do you have a name? She asked. He shook his head. Names are for people who plan to stay. And with that he walked back toward the door. She didn't stop him. He opened it, letting a gust of snow and wind slice into the warmth. Before stepping out, he turned back once more. Your father was a better man than you know, but not better by much. Then he was gone. Lucille locked the door behind him, bolted it for good measure. Then she sat at the table, heart steady but mind racing. Had Emma known about him? Had Jonah? The next morning, Lucille made coffee and sat by the window watching the trees for signs of movement. Nothing but snow. By noon, Jonah arrived, no warning, no call. She opened the door without speaking. He looked tired again, distracted, restless. He handed her a manila envelope. Draft copy, story outline, legal protections. Lucille flipped through the pages quickly, too quickly to actually read. Jonah sipped the coffee she offered. You've been busy, she said. It's time sensitive, he said. I'm getting offers. Not just from newsrooms, from producers, streaming services. People are calling this the next Tinker Tailor, but real. Lucille closed the folder. I haven't agreed to anything. Jonah paused. I thought we had an understanding. We had a conversation. You said you wanted the truth out. This feels like something else. He set his mug down. Lucille, this is your legacy. But it's also a national story. The world deserves to know. And you deserve the byline. He looked stung, just briefly. I'm not exploiting you. She nodded slowly, but her eyes stayed on him. I had a visitor last night, she said. His eyebrows lifted. Someone who served with Mercer. Someone who wasn't happy this is all coming to light. Jonah leaned in. Did he threaten you? Lucille shook her head. Not exactly. He warned me, said not to trust uniforms or journalists. Jonah sat back. I'm not here to steal your story, he said. But you are here to sell it, she replied. The silence between them grew thick. Lucille tapped the folder. Who else has seen this? Just my editor. Which one? He hesitated. She saw it. A sliver of guilt. Lucille stood. I want full control of what gets published, my terms, my name, my ending. Of course. Don't of course me, Jonah. I've been erased once already. I won't let it happen again. He nodded slowly. Lucille walked to the window again, her eyes scanning the ridge. Somewhere out there was a man with no name who knew everything, and sitting in her chair was a woman with too many names who had finally found her voice. But now she had to decide what to do with it, and who, if anyone, deserved to hear it. Lucille knew something was wrong the moment she saw the Mercedes pull into her driveway. Too sleek, too polished, too familiar. It was Connor. She stood at the kitchen window watching him step out, expensive coat flapping, one hand holding a briefcase, the other already swiping across the screen of his phone. The nerve of him to return here after everything, after the live stream stunt, after the silence that came between betrayal and self-interest. She didn't move until he knocked. Then she opened the door slowly, not with warmth, but with finality. Hi, Graham, he said, trying a smile. She stared. I was in town, he added. Thought I'd stop by, just you and me. Lucille stepped aside wordlessly. Bear didn't bark. He simply sat by the stove, eyes narrowed, tail still. Connor walked in like he still belonged there, his eyes flicking over the books on the table, the briefcase, the wood-burning fire, the papers she'd left stacked with red ribbon. She motioned to the chair. "Sit." He did. He placed the briefcase on the table between them and opened it. Neatly organized documents, a pen, a thick contract printed on cream-colored legal paper. "I've been talking to a few people," he said. "Producers, publishers. You're kind of a big deal now, you know that." Lucille said nothing. "They think your story could be optioned. Film rights, book deal, maybe even a docuseries. We're talking major dollars." He slid the paper toward her. "This is a simple rights release," he said, tapping the contract. "It just clarifies that you waive any claim to future royalties or ownership of the narrative material. That way the studios can move forward." Lucille looked at the heading. Assignment of intellectual property, legacy assets. "Legacy assets," she said aloud flatly. Connor nodded eagerly. "It's better for you this way. No litigation, no haggling over credit. You get a payout up front, 6 figures, 7 depending on interest. You can relax, travel. And you," he smiled, "I'll handle the rest. Distribution, strategy. Think of me as your executive representative." Lucille's eyes didn't blink. "The same grandson who locked me out of my own house now wants to represent me." "Graham," he said, laughing nervously. Come on, that's not fair." "You're right," she said. "It's not fair. Because fair would be letting me take a bat to your car and walking away." He leaned back, wounded but not deterred. "Look, I know we've had our issues, but this is bigger than us." She stared at the document again. His tone shifted harder now, edges showing. "I'm offering you a lifeline, Lucille. You sign that you'll never have to worry about anything again. Just be the sweet old woman who found the tapes, smile for the cameras, and let the people who understand the business handle the rest." Her eyes flicked up. "You're threatening me," she said, calm. "No, I'm protecting you," he snapped. "From the sharks who are already circling. You think the FBI's going to let you keep this narrative. You think Netflix isn't going to spin it how they want." He leaned closer. "You're not a writer, Graham. You're a relic. You've already served your purpose." Lucille's hand slid beneath the table. She pressed a button. A faint click sounded under the mantel, barely audible beneath the fire. Connor didn't notice. He kept talking. "This is how you stay in the good graces. Sign. Take the money. Walk away before someone decides you're in the way." She looked down at the paper, then back up at him. "Funny thing," she said. "I spent the last 10 years thinking I didn't matter. And now everyone wants my name on their contract." He pushed the pen toward her. Lucille smiled. "Would you like to hear what you sound like when you're threatening a 72-year-old woman for her legacy?" Connor froze. She reached into the drawer and pulled out a small black recorder. She hit play. The voice echoed back, his voice clear, sharp, and damning. "You're not a writer, Graham. You're a relic." Connor's face drained of color. "Sign. Take the money. Walk away." He lunged for the device. Lucille was faster. She held it up just out of reach. "Sit down." He obeyed. Her voice, now cold steel, cut through the room. "You want to exploit me. That much is clear. But I'm not the woman you kicked out of her own life anymore." She stood, walked to her desk, and pulled out a USB drive. "This," she said, "contains the full audio file and a video backup courtesy of the camera I installed after your last visit." She held up the USB. "I'm uploading it." "Don't," Connor breathed, standing. But it was too late. She plugged the drive into her laptop, clicked, and uploaded it to her old Twitter account, the one she hadn't touched in 8 years, back when she followed a few knitting blogs and weather alerts. She typed only one sentence. "My grandson came to silence me." This is what he said. She hit upload. Within seconds it was live. The audio played over a simple still frame of Connor captured from the video, his hand mid-gesture, mouth open fury, frozen in motion. He stood in shock. "You're insane," he hissed. Lucille turned calm. "No, I'm awake." And the world was watching. Within 20 minutes, the post had 30,000 views. By the hour's end, 200,000. The Frozen Agent trended across platforms. Comments flooded in. "She's a queen. This is elder abuse caught in 4K. Protect Lucille at all costs. This woman just blew up her whole greedy family and I'm here for it." News outlets caught wind. The audio was rebroadcast on 3 major networks. The FBI reached out. Jonah called twice. Emma sent a one-word text, "respect." Connor stood in the cabin like a man exiled from his own plan. Lucille walked him to the door. "You forgot one thing, Connor," she said. "What?" She opened the door and pointed toward the dark where the wind howled like history waking up. "You forgot that you were raised by someone who used to be afraid to speak." He walked out defeated. She didn't watch him leave. She just shut the door and locked it. The morning after Lucille's post went viral, Connor Holloway was arrested. Not by men in masks or black vans. No, it was quieter than that. Clinical. Cold. He stepped out of his luxury condo in downtown Denver wearing sunglasses and a leather jacket he hadn't earned, and found 3 federal agents waiting beside an unmarked sedan. "Mr. Holloway," one of them said, holding up a badge. "You're being taken in for questioning regarding allegations of financial coercion, elder abuse, and attempted fraudulent transfer of intellectual property." Connor's smile didn't even get halfway up his cheek before they had him in cuffs. The charges weren't for breaking into Lucille's life. That wasn't a crime, not exactly. But trying to strip her of her story, to weaponize his bloodline and turn it into currency, that left footprints. And Lucille had given the world a trail of them, audio, video, and motive served on a digital platter. By noon, cable news was airing the arrest footage. By 3 o'clock, Lucille's voicemail was full. Reporters, lawyers, producers, strangers from everywhere, offering praise, solidarity, outrage, and sometimes unsolicited book deals. But she didn't answer the phone. She was sitting at her dining table, sun pouring through the windows, a fresh mug of tea in her hands and across from her Jonah Creed. He held a new letter in his lap, this one official and stamped. "It's settled," he said, eyes scanning the final lines. "You retain full legal ownership of all documents, recordings, and narratives originating from the Mercer cache." Lucille nodded. "And you?" she asked. Jonah smiled just a little. "I get to say I was the first to break the story. I keep my byline, I cite the source, and I walk away knowing I didn't screw it up." She sipped her tea. "Not screwing it up is a rare gift these days." Jonah chuckled. "I learned the hard way." There was a pause between them, comfortable now, earned. "Are you angry?" he asked. She looked out the window. "At who?" "Connor." She considered. "No, not anymore." "Why not?" "Because anger keeps you tethered to the part of someone that hurt you. I've already cut the rope." Jonah let that settle in the air. The silence was broken by a knock. Not frantic, not invasive, just professional. Lucille opened the door and found 2 women standing on the porch. One wore jeans and a denim jacket. The other carried a leather messenger bag and a smile that had likely closed deals on 4 continents. "Miss Holloway," the one in denim said, offering her hand. "My name's Marissa Dent. I'm a producer with Netflix Originals. This is my colleague, Elaine." Lucille shook her hand slowly. "We've been following your story," Marissa continued. "We'd love to talk to you about adapting your experience, your life, into a documentary series. Possibly a limited dramatization if you're open to it. We believe the world needs to hear this from your voice." Lucille tilted her head. "Why now?" Marissa didn't flinch. "Because you finally made them listen." Lucille glanced back at Jonah, who stood in the doorway watching the exchange. She turned back to the women. "You're not the first." "I'm sure we're not," Marissa said. "But we may be the only ones willing to give you complete editorial input." Lucille raised an eyebrow. "That includes final say on casting, narration, pacing, everything," Marissa added. "You won't just be the subject. You'll be the author." Lucille leaned against the doorframe. "You think I'm interested in turning my trauma into content?" Marissa's smile softened. "I think you're interested in turning your truth into a legacy." That made Lucille pause. She motioned for them to sit at the picnic table outside. Bear followed her tail, wagging slightly. They sat under a sky scraped clean by wind clouds like soft bruises drifting west. "Tell me what you have in mind," Lucille said. Elaine pulled out a tablet and swiped to a storyboard. Scenes appeared. Berlin streets in shadow. A child carried through snow. A bunker door opening, an elderly woman holding a cassette recorder in her hand like a weapon. Lucille studied each one. Then she looked at the 2 women. "Fine," she said. "But only if I narrate it myself." Marissa smiled. "We were hoping you'd say that." Inside, Jonah watched them from the window. He smiled too, but it was quieter, more private. This was what redemption looked like. Not vindication through revenge, but through reclaiming the narrative. He stepped outside and joined them. "We'll need to be careful," he said. "There's still a lot of classified material. Agencies will push back." Lucille looked at him steady. Let them. Jonah smiled. You sure? I was erased once, she said. I won't let it happen again. And as the conversation deepened, contracts proposed visions, exchanged timelines, discussed the sun climbed higher over the peaks, lighting the trees in gold. Lucille sat straighter than she had in years. She wasn't just the survivor anymore. She was the voice, the witness, and the world was finally listening. The road unfurled like ribbon through the heart of America, endless, wide, and waiting. The RV moved steadily along it, humming like a living thing, a home on wheels held together by steel and stubbornness. At the wheel sat Lucille Holloway, a woman who once thought her story had ended the moment her family turned her away. Now she drove forward with purpose. Her hands were firm on the steering wheel, her eyes shaded behind round sunglasses, and beside her, snoring softly with his head resting on her thigh, was Bear. They'd been on the road for 16 days. She'd passed through Kansas wheat fields and Arkansas cotton towns, the foggy highways of Tennessee, the dusty flats of New Mexico, and the pine-walled valleys of Utah. Her only schedule was the sun and where it landed. She had no destination beyond the next horizon, and that was enough. Each morning she rose early and boiled coffee in a dented tin kettle, poured it slowly into a steel mug, and sat outside her rig watching the day unfold. Sometimes strangers passed. Hikers, families, retirees, who'd sold everything for freedom on 4 wheels. She didn't speak to most of them, though she nodded politely when their eyes met. Most didn't know who she was. Some did. A few stopped to thank her. One cried. She didn't need gratitude. She needed movement. She needed quiet. On the 17th night, she parked at a national park somewhere along the Oregon border. The trees stretched taller here, the air cleaner, colder. The ranger at the gate had looked twice at her license, then at her face, but said nothing except, "Enjoy your stay, ma'am." That night the stars bled out over the forest canopy so clear it felt like the sky had been scrubbed. Lucille set up a folding chair beside her RV, pulled a thick blanket over her lap, and held her phone in her hands for a long time before opening the livestream app. She hadn't spoken publicly since the Netflix deal was announced. She hadn't said anything personal since her father's voice played from a machine buried under years of silence. Tonight she would. The screen blinked on. A small red circle lit up in the corner. Within seconds the numbers ticked upward, live viewers from New York, Prague, Sydney, Berlin. Lucille sat still, her face framed by the flicker of firelight behind her and the silhouette of Bear lying quietly nearby. She cleared her throat. I used to think, she began slowly, that life came in 3 acts. She looked up at the trees. Childhood, adulthood, then decline. That was the story we were told. That's what they teach you. Somewhere around 70, you're supposed to become invisible, tidy, predictable. You're supposed to shrink. She paused. But let me tell you something, that's a lie. The chat box on the stream exploded, comments pouring in, emojis, applause gifs, the hashtag #Lucille. Live started trending again. Lucille leaned closer to the phone. I was 72 when the world finally saw me. Not because I yelled, not because I demanded to be noticed, but because I stopped apologizing for being in the way. She let that sit for a moment. I found something beneath the snow. Not just tapes. Not just old lies. I found a version of myself that had been buried with them, a woman I barely remembered, a girl they tried to erase. Bear shifted beside her ears, flicking at the wind. I thought my life was over the day my grandchildren told me I didn't belong in my own home, that I was no longer useful, that I was in the way. Her voice didn't shake. But what I've learned is that sometimes you have to dig deep beneath the frost, beneath the shame, beneath the betrayal, and there under all that weight you might just find the truth. And if you're lucky, it saves you. She looked at the lens directly now. Her eyes didn't blink. I'm not a hero, I'm not a genius, I'm not even particularly brave. She smiled. But I am free, and I wasn't always. The fire behind her popped softly. The trees didn't move. The world held its breath. Don't wait to be rescued, she said. Don't wait for permission to matter. She reached down and scratched Bear's ears. Start where you are, with what you have. Even if what you have is just a pair of old boots, a dusty truth, and a name no one remembers. She looked at the stars. They tried to write me out of history, but I rewrote the ending. Then she held the phone up, giving her followers a view of the treetops and stars overhead. This is what the last act looks like when you steal back the pen. And with that, she ended the stream. She sat in silence for a while longer, watching the fire die down. Bear snored softly, and the wind whispered through the branches. Inside the RV, a map was pinned to the wall. Dozens of red dots marked the places she'd been more waited to be filled. The road ahead was unknown, but it was hers. Before turning in for the night, she wrote in her journal, "I used to believe I was the final chapter in someone else's book. But maybe I'm the first page of something new." As the night deepened, the screen faded to black. Then in white lettering, one final sentence appeared. "Not everyone fades with age. Some women don't begin their lives until 72.